Welcome, everybody. This is Jeff Frimith from JF Medical Physics, and today's topic will be considerations regarding radiology room designs. And I think we have a great panel of speakers here bringing different levels of expertise. So Steve, if you want to sort of introduce yourself a little bit to everybody, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, Steve Jensen, president of CSP Medical. We're based in London, Ontario, Canada, and we distribute all types of medical equipment to hospitals primarily.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Toby?
So I'm Tobias Gilk, and I wear two hats on a daily basis. One of them is I am Senior Vice President of Radiology Planning, which is an architectural planning design firm that, as the name suggests, principally does radiology, nuclear medicine, radiation therapy facilities. My other hat is I'm founder of my own consulting, Gilk Radiology Consultants, and through that I do a lot of MRI safety consulting to providers and to manufacturers as well.
Great, thank you. Bob?
I'm Bob Finch from UltraRay, one of the sales reps here for radiation shielding. UltraRay is a manufacturer and distributor of lead-based radiation shielding solutions. We serve primarily hospitals, X-ray clinics, chiropractic offices, dental practices, vets, nuclear power plants, and whatnot. Anything when it comes to shielding, lead's our game, and we're here for you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you everybody for agreeing to be part of this, and I look forward to a great and informative discussion with the audience. So just sort of starting with Steve first, and then working to Toby and then to Bob, just sort of bringing forth a first question, if you will, just in terms of the planning of either a brand new or a renovated radiology room, whether it be one for general X-ray or a CT room or whatever. What sorts of general considerations that would really help the personnel in the planning stages of preparing to undertake this this type of project?
Excellent question. So just to clarify, we don't actually, CSP Medical, we don't actually do the room planning. We provide solutions for medical equipment. So what an example of that is, we have a checklist, let's say for MRI, for example. So a listing of all the different equipment that would go into the room, everything from patient monitors to MRI safe furniture. So we provide that to either the OEM or the hospital, the equipment planner. And that's basically gives them an overview of what equipment to go into the room. So that's basically what we do.
Great, great. Toby?
I'm going to step a little bit earlier than Steve did in the overall timeline
Sure.
of things. And this may seem like a strange, first thing or most important thing from somebody whose job it is to design the space. But for me, the biggest questions aren't about, how big should the room be, or are we going to paint it purple or do LED lights or whatnot. For me, the biggest question really stems from changes in the way we use diagnostic imaging. I'm sort of tipping my hand here. Diagnostic imaging, it's not strictly diagnostic anymore. We now use imaging as a platform for intervention. So my first question, before we begin talking about how big is the room, or we get to the issues that Steve was rightly bringing up about, what equipment and material are we going to put in the room? Before those, my first question is, how do we want to use the room clinically? Is it strictly diagnostic? What are our patient populations? What are the specific needs of those patient populations? If we move to an interventional or an intraoperative kind of platform for clinical services, how does that change, what we need from the room, from the space? Is it medical gases? Is it scrubbable surfaces? Is it more working space for clinicians and equipment? So I in my opinion, the single biggest thing associated with planning new radiologic facilities is not the facility. It's the clinical utilization, with the idea that, we're going to buy a piece of equipment that, God willing, is going to last us 10, 12, 15 years. So not only do we need to look at, how do we practice today, but I think we also need to take into account how are we likely to practice 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and if we can, 10 years from now.
Great. Thank you, Toby. Bob?
Well, I always hope the customer will come to us after they've talked to Steve and Toby. So usually we come in towards the end of things when they're ready to start construction and start lining the room. So we're going to be asked the most common question by far, and I'll get the calls on a daily basis. A new practice, a clinic, or even a hospital's opening up, wing is opening up, and they'll call and they'll say, we need lead, we need to line the wall. And the first question I have to ask, and I always come back, is, well, okay, great, what thickness of lead do you need? Because that's the biggest question for us, and it makes a big difference. It's a big difference in weight, it's a big difference in price, and you have to kind of get that established before we can even talk about coming to the table and bringing a service. So a lot of the clients, they get that homework done, then they come to us, and then we're able to help them out a little bit.
Okay, no, great, thank you. Just to sort of, I think, go in line with most of everyone's sort of points here, it just kind of rings a bell to me. I like what Toby was saying here, as well as what Bob had alluded to as well, is that, if you don't, I think if you don't talk to the customer and find out what their needs are, not only now in the present, but also in the future, 5, 10, 20 years, whatever down the line, the cost of not asking that question and having to redesign and reconstruct a room or rooms is probably going to be significantly greater than planning earlier on, right? Ahead of the game, so to speak. So I think that's an important thing for everyone to keep in mind. So next question: what sorts of standards regarding radiology room planning exist, or should customers, facilities, hospitals, clinics, whatnot, sort of consider implementing or consider thinking about and implementing with their project? Or are there not any standards, and it's basically sort of a grab bag of whatever the customer wants to have in place?
So what I typically do is refer back to default to the RSO and what their legal requirements are. So we deal in Canada and the US. So we'll typically pass that back and say, well, what are your local regulatory standards for that, for things like lead thickness, like Bob mentioned. So that's typically what we do. And we just like to keep ourselves out of hot water if we at all possible.
Sure.
So from a planning sort of standard standpoint, you really have 3 different distinct levels, and most of the time they largely agree, but every once in a while you'll get conflicts between and among those different levels. And so we have just your basic, building design and construction and life safety requirements that are typically, at least in the States, administered on a municipal level. Then you'll frequently have, for a healthcare provider, you'll probably have an additional healthcare design standard that would be above and beyond. And in the States, that's typically invoked at the state level and getting state, Department of Health approval for a new installation, new piece of equipment. And then the third level associated with that is typically accreditation. So you may have specific requirements imposed by Joint Commission or ACR or other organizations like that. And as I say, most of the time there isn't outright conflict between and among those standards. But when you get into, highly specific spaces like radiology, it is not unusual to come across well, the basic building code says at the fork in the road, take the left, and an accreditation standard says, well, whatever you do, make sure you turn right at the fork in the road. And so sometimes there are means of trying to resolve that. I would, my caution with respect to referencing these standards is they are all written to be lowest common denominator. So the notion that codes and standards are essentially a checklist to best practice, we should disabuse ourselves of that notion. Codes and standards are minimum performance requirements that apply as broadly as possible to as many sites and as many clinical applications as possible. And your site, your equipment, your clinical use may have needs significantly different than those base codes and standards.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Bob?
Well, it's funny because I actually find the whole the industry itself is a funny one in the sense that we sell lead materials to people all the time who are going out and installing the product, and I often make a joke that you need to have a license in this province to install a toilet, but you don't to put lead on the wall in a radiation environment. So it's kind of funny in that way because. When you talk about standards, but from our perspective, there really isn't any, or there's some sort of general guidelines that we like to talk about. From my point of view as a supplier, I always drive home the fact. I think Steve alluded to this. I default back to the RSO, they're the most important person in all of this. So they're going to be at least determine that lead thickness. And then once we get that determined, we can talk about basic principles like making sure you overlap the lead, making sure if you want a window, for instance, a lead glass window, making sure that it's laminated or safety rated if it's going into a door so that it can withstand an impact. Little things like that you kind of keep in the back of your mind so that you can pass on that tidbit of information to the person who's doing the actual installing. But it's amazing how many people ask the question, well, how do I install this material? How do I put it up there? And in some ways, there's really no right or wrong. There's really no right or wrong answer to it. So it's up to for me. It's like I said, it's making sure the experts are giving their expert opinion from the get-go, and then walking people through the process using some common guidelines a little bit. But it's probably something as well that an opportunity I think exists to educate a lot of people who are in this industry to make sure things are kind of done and not just at the bare minimum, that are done really well so that everybody is safe 10, 20 years down the road.
Absolutely. No, some great points for sure. Maybe just very quickly, just to try to wrap this up a little bit. One last sort of question. And this is sort of, one general question, but it's sort of specific to each individual speaker here. So Steve, yourself as president of CSP Medical that sells different products and accessories for hospitals and clinics and whatnot, what types of personnel or types of individuals and roles of those individuals does CSP really need to collaborate with in order to get sort of the maximize efficiency for any sort of radiology room planning projects? Like, is it the president of a hospital, the manager? Who do you typically collaborate with?
Typically, we stick with the director of radiology or the specific modality manager, just nuclear medicine or any of those different areas. And from there, they would have the equipment planner, construction company, their team, the hospital team. So I can piggyback onto that team and offer suggestions.
Great.
Yeah, and a lot of times the chief technologist will be involved. They'll give the sometimes the RSL.
Okay, excellent, great, thank you. Toby, who do you usually resonate with, so to speak, in terms of planning? in with hospitals and clinics? What types of individuals do you, as an architect, essentially really need to be collaborating with in order for the project to be maximized efficiently?
I generally tend to pursue 3 separate tracks simultaneously. I like to go through administration for the basic project parameters and constraints. You know, they're the ones who have to answer for a budget. So let's start out by figuring out what we have to work with and what our operational constraints are. Second, to go to the head modality radiologist and identify, okay, you know, what do you currently do clinically? What have you wanted to do but have been incapable for staff or resources or what have you? And you know, the crystal ball question of where do you see yourself in 5 years in terms of you know, services available through this modality. So then the administration and the radiologist really kind of serve as the bookends for the project, defining the functional or practical limitations, and then the clinical aspirations. And then I fill in the middle essentially with the technologists. And I want to speak to them and better understand, you know, okay, your doc says they really want to do this, you know, how would we do that? You know, if you had to do that with your existing facility, you know, what would you see as lacking or extraneous to being able to do these? And then once you kind of begin to build these workflow patterns based on the different types of scans, different types of patients, different types of clinical demands. From that, you can really begin to construct a mental model of how this new facility, this new scanner really should work. And then the mental model leads ultimately to the physical model, you know, becomes the blueprints.
Sure. No, great. Thank you. Bob?
Well, with the, you know, with regards to the actual staff, it's typically the radiation safety people. They're obviously important, but we deal primarily with the installers, so the contractors and the architects themselves. And it's important to get that communication right from the get-go with the architect, probably before the job is even spec'd, because little things like to try to there's the theoretical that can be done, and then there's the practical that can be done. So it's when you know, when the client says to the architect, I want a wall, and I want the whole wall to be lead glass so I can see through and have this wonderful open feel. Okay, that's great and fine and dandy until they realize at the end it's going to cost you $100 grand to put that in. So it's all of a sudden nothing. It's no longer feasible to do that. So to talk to the architect from right from the get-go to sort of say, okay, here's what you're up against. Here's a more practical solution for your client. That's a real benefit. And then we're talking to the people who are actually doing the installation, whether that is a third-party contractor or the maintenance team at a facility.
Sure. Great. Well, everyone, thank you very much. I think this has been certainly enlightening and educational for myself, and I'm sure it's been the same for anyone that will be watching this recording. And again, I thank everyone very much for their time. If any of the audience members or people that will watch this webinar, this recording, have any questions for myself or for any of the speakers, I'll have the some contact information on the YouTube link for the video, and you can just send us an email and we'll relay the questions accordingly to make sure we get you the right answers. So without further ado, thank you again very much, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sure.